In 1940, the Mediterranean was not just a sea, it was a road. For Britain, it was one of the most important roads in the world. Through the Mediterranean ran routes to Egypt, the Suez Canal, the Middle East, and the wider British Empire. If those routes were broken, Britain would not simply lose ships. It would lose time, fuel, supplies, and strategic freedom. Italy understood this. When Mussolini brought Italy into the war in June of 1940, the balance inside the Mediterranean changed. The Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, was large, modern, and dangerous. Its battleships could threaten British convoys. Its bases sat close to the center of the sea. Its aircraft could strike from land bases. Its fleet did not have to sail far to become a problem. Taranto in southern Italy became one of the keys. Inside its harbor, protected by guns, nets, searchlights, and distance, the Italian battle fleet could wait. It did not need to fight every day. Its simple existence forced the British to think carefully before moving ships, convoys, or troops through the Mediterranean. A fleet in harbor can still be a weapon. If the British moved too boldly, Italian battleships might come out. If the British became too cautious, supplies and operations would suffer. Taranto was not only a port, it was a threat sitting behind a shield. The Royal Navy needed to reduce that threat. A traditional surface attack would be dangerous. Sending battleships close to a heavily defended harbor was almost unthinkable. Submarines had limits. Bombing from high altitude was uncertain. Taranto needed another answer. That answer came from the aircraft carrier. But the aircraft that would carry the plan looked almost absurd beside the steel monsters they were sent to attack. The Fairey Swordfish was slow. It had two wings, a fabric-covered structure, and a design that seemed to belong to an earlier age. Its crews were exposed to wind, cold, and enemy fire. It could not outrun modern fighters. It could not survive punishment like a battleship. Yet it had one quality that mattered above everything else. It could fly low, steady, and slow enough to place a torpedo with deadly precision. In a war filled with speed and armor, the old biplane still had a role. And soon, it would be asked to fly into one of the most dangerous harbors in Europe. But before the attack could happen, the British had to solve a problem that seemed to make the entire plan impossible. The water at Taranto was shallow. A torpedo dropped from an aircraft does not simply enter the water and run forward. It falls. It dives. It needs depth to stabilize. In deep water, this is manageable. In a shallow harbor, a torpedo might hit the bottom, break apart, bury itself in mud, or run uselessly. Taranto's harbor was not supposed to be easy prey for aerial torpedoes. The Italians understood that shallow water gave some protection. Even if aircraft reached the harbor, could their torpedoes work properly? The British believed they could. The Fleet Air Arm prepared for the mission with that problem in mind. Torpedoes were adapted for shallow water attacks. The Swordfish crews trained for low-level approaches and precise drops. The mission required calm execution because there would be little room for correction. Everything depended on details: height, speed, angle, timing, moonlight. The path into the harbor. The location of balloons and guns. The positions of the battleships. A Swordfish crew had to do several things at once. The pilot had to keep the aircraft low and stable. The observer had to navigate in darkness. The gunner had to watch for threats. All of them had to move through a sky that could turn lethal at any second. This was not a clean duel. It was a night operation against a defended harbor, with old aircraft, over dark water, against capital ships. The British plan was called Operation Judgment. The carrier HMS Illustrious would launch the strike. The Swordfish would fly in waves. Some aircraft would carry torpedoes. Others would drop flares and bombs, lighting the harbor and distracting defenses. The attack would not depend on brute strength. It would depend on surprise, coordination, and courage. On paper, the idea was elegant. In reality, it was terrifying. The men preparing to fly that night knew what they were facing. They were not attacking trucks on a road or infantry positions in a field. They were attacking a battle fleet inside its own base. A harbor can look calm from a distance, but once the alarm sounds, it becomes a trap of light and metal. Searchlights begin to sweep. Guns begin to fire. Shell bursts fill the sky. Reflections on the water confuse distance and direction. Smoke hides the target one moment and reveals it the next. And through that, a swordfish had to keep flying. Slowly, low over the water, close enough to drop, close enough to die. As evening fell on November 11, 1940, the crews prepared for takeoff. The old biplanes waited on the deck of HMS Illustrious. Their engines coughed into life, and the first wave lifted into the night. The swordfish did not look like the future, but that night they carried the future under their wings. The aircraft left HMS Illustrious and crossed the dark Mediterranean toward Taranto. Below them was black water. Ahead of them was one of the most important naval targets in Europe. Inside the harbor, the Italian fleet rested. The battleships were not at sea. They were not maneuvering. They were anchored. That made them vulnerable in one way and protected in another. They could not dodge like ships in open water, but they were surrounded by the defenses of their own base. For the British crews, the approach was a test of nerves. Night flying in 1940 was already dangerous. Navigation was imperfect. Weather, darkness, and distance could scatter aircraft. The swordfish were slow enough that the journey itself felt long. Every minute gave more time for something to go wrong. Then Taranto appeared. Harbor lights, dark shapes, warships at anchor. The outline of the fleet. The first wave came in. Flares began to fall. They turned the harbor into a strange battlefield of light and shadow. Searchlights answered. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The night, quiet moments before, became violent. Shell bursts marked the sky. Tracer fire climbed upward. Reflections flashed across the water. Now the swordfish crews could see what they had come for. Battleships, huge, dark, still, and waiting. The aircraft carrying torpedoes dropped low. They had to approach close enough for a proper release, but not so close that they were destroyed before the torpedo entered the water. They came in at low altitude, moving through fire, forcing themselves toward the targets. The pilots could not think like men trying to survive. For a few seconds, they had to think like instruments. Hold the line, keep the height, release at the right moment, climb away if there is still time. One swordfish released its torpedo, then another. The weapons hit the water and ran. In the harbor, Italian crews realized that the impossible was happening. Aircraft were not just bombing the base. They were launching torpedoes inside the harbor itself. The first hits came like a shock. Explosions tore through the waterline of battleships that had seemed safe behind harbor defenses. Steel plates bent, compartments flooded. Crews fought to understand the damage in darkness and confusion. The attack was not massive by later wartime standards. It was not hundreds of aircraft. It was not a giant bomber stream. It was a small force of old biplanes. But in a harbor filled with capital ships, precision mattered more than numbers. The first wave had opened the wound. The second wave was still coming. After the first attacks, Taranto was awake. The defenders now knew they were under serious attack. Searchlights scanned the sky. Anti-aircraft fire intensified. Smoke began to drift over the water. Flares still burned. The harbor was no longer a target, quietly waiting in the dark. It was a battlefield. The second wave of swordfish approached under worse conditions. Surprise had weakened. The defenses were alert. The sky was brighter and more dangerous, yet the second wave still had to press in, because the mission was not only to frighten the Italian fleet, it was to cripple it. A night attack has a strange rhythm. For the pilots, everything happens in fragments. A flash of a ship, a searchlight beam, the black curve of the harbor, the white burst of anti-aircraft fire, the sudden shape of a mast, water rushing below, the torpedo release, the pull away. For the men on the ships, the attack is just as fragmented. Alarms, orders, running feet, damage reports, guns firing into darkness, explosions from directions that are hard to identify. The sense that the enemy is above, but also everywhere. The battleship Littorio was hit. Conte di Cavour was badly damaged. Caio Duilio was struck as well. The British had done what many thought was unlikely. They had reached the Italian battle fleet and damaged it seriously inside its own harbor. The cost was not nothing. 2 swordfish were lost. In a force that small, 2 aircraft mattered. Behind every aircraft were men who had crossed the sea in darkness and flown into fire. But when the surviving crews turned back toward HMS Illustrious, they carried with them a result far larger than the number of aircraft involved. Taranto was burning. The Italian fleet had been hit hard. The balance in the Mediterranean had shifted. The old biplanes had proved that a harbor was not enough protection. A battleship could be anchored, surrounded by defenses, and still be vulnerable from the air. By morning, the images were clear. Damaged ships, flooded hulls, smoke over the harbor, crews trying to save vessels that, only hours earlier, had represented Italian naval power. The raid did not destroy the entire Italian Navy. It did not end the war in the Mediterranean. But it changed the calculation. The Royal Navy had shown that carrier aircraft could strike a battle fleet at anchor with devastating effect. And other nations were watching. Taranto became more than a British success. It became a lesson. For decades, battleships had symbolized naval power. They were expensive, heavily armored, and politically important. Nations built them as statements of strength. Admirals planned around them. The public understood them as floating fortresses. But the attack on Taranto showed a different future. A cheaper aircraft, launched from a carrier, could reach into a harbor and damage ships that took years to build. The weapon did not need to match the battleship's armor. It needed to hit the right place. This did not mean battleships became useless overnight. The war would still see battleships fight, bombard, escort, and survive punishment. But the center of gravity was moving. Air power at sea was no longer a supporting detail. It was becoming decisive. The Swordfish helped prove that. The irony is that they did it while looking outdated. Their slow speed, which seemed like a weakness, helped them in certain kinds of torpedo attacks. Their crews could fly low and controlled. They could operate from carriers. They could carry weapons that mattered. That night, the future did not arrive as a sleek modern machine. It arrived as a slow biplane over a dark harbor. Taranto also became part of a larger chain of ideas. Naval planners around the world studied what happened. The concept of attacking ships in harbor from the air was no longer theoretical. It had been done. Just over a year later, another harbor would be attacked from the air on a much larger scale. Pearl Harbor would become one of the most famous attacks in history. Taranto was not Pearl Harbor. The scale, politics, geography, and consequences were different. But the principle had already been demonstrated. Anchored fleets could be vulnerable to carrier aircraft, even in places once considered protected. For the British, Taranto was a badly needed victory in a dangerous theater. For the Italians, it was a shock. For the world, it was a warning. And for the men who flew those swordfish, it was a night of cold air, engine noise, searchlights, gunfire, and the impossible task of guiding old aircraft towards some of the most powerful ships in Europe. The attack on Taranto is sometimes overshadowed by larger battles. It did not have the scale of Midway. It did not have the global shock of Pearl Harbor. It did not involve thousands of aircraft or entire fleets clashing in open water. But that is exactly what makes it so powerful as a story. It was small enough to understand. 21 aircraft, 1 carrier, 1 harbor, 1 night. A fleet that believed distance, guns, and shallow water gave it protection. And then the sound of slow engines in the dark. Taranto matters because it shows how war can change when someone solves a problem differently. The British did not need to match the Italian fleet ship for ship. They found a way to strike the fleet where it was vulnerable. They used timing. They used surprise. They used training. They used an aircraft many people underestimate. This is the kind of moment that changes military thinking. Not because everything after it becomes simple, but because one assumption dies. Before Taranto, many people still believed that battleships resting in a defended harbor were extremely difficult targets for carrier aircraft. After Taranto, nobody could believe that in the same way. The old biplanes had flown through the dark and left behind a new reality. From that night forward, every admiral had to imagine aircraft over the harbor. Every fleet at anchor had to think about the sky. And every battleship, no matter how powerful, had to share the sea with a new kind of danger. The Fairey Swordfish was not beautiful in the way fast fighters were beautiful. It was slow, awkward, and old-fashioned. But on one night in November, it did exactly what history needed it to do. It proved that the age of naval warfare had changed. And it did it before dawn.